Hello everyone, I am Seema Agarwal, clinical psychologist, associate and hypnotherapist. Today I will be talking about trauma, but let's understand trauma first. Trauma can be understood as an experience so overwhelming that it disrupts our sense of safety, stability and integrity. It not only leaves an imprint on our mind but on our body and spirit as well. Think of trauma like a storm. For some, it passes quickly, leaving only puddles. But for others, it uproots trees, floods homes, and changes the landscapes forever. The storm is the same, but how it's felt is deeply personal. Trauma can enter our lives into many ways, some of which you might recognize from your own experience, such as war, abuse, neglect, sudden death of a loved one, serious hospitalization, even a medical procedure without consent could be the one. But we have to understand this. Not every adverse experience is a trauma, but every traumatic event is an adverse experience. In psychology, we always define trauma in three ways. First is acute trauma. This happens after a single highly stressful event, such as natural disaster or a death of a loved one. Second is chronic trauma, which arises from repeated or prolonged exposure to harmful situations like ongoing abuse, domestic violence. And then there is complex trauma, which is often linked to what people call generational trauma. And it arises when someone endures multiple long term traumatic experiences. For example, a child who grew up facing neglect or abandonment may carry the weight of complex trauma into adulthood. But these categories don't capture everything. Trauma can also be experienced indirectly. This is known as secondary or vicarious trauma. When someone develops symptoms simply by being close to another person who have endured it. In other words, trauma does not affect the person who have gone through it. It can ripple outward, touching those around them too. There is no universal rule book as how someone will respond to trauma. Each person's reaction is shaped by their own history, resilience, and circumstances. It varies from individual to individual. Initial reactions of trauma could be behavioral, physical, emotional, or even existential. We must recognize that these reactions are absolutely normal. In fact, these reactions serve an important purpose. They preserve the mind and body to preserve a sense of equilibrium in the midst of a crisis. However, when these reactions continue long after the event has passed, when the danger is over and the stability should have returned, then they become problematic. Then we are no longer talking about short term reactions. In fact, long term responses. And long term responses are known as fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Fawn means public pleasing, difficulty saying no. These are not random behaviors. These are survival instincts deeply woven into who we are. They shape how a person reacts when faced with something they perceive as threatening, when the danger is not truly there. But why? An event can be traumatic for some, yet for others, it might just be an adverse experience. They can manage and move past. It all comes down to three important factors. First, there are variables specific to the person experiencing the event. Think about age, gender, or someone has psychological issues before. Second, the event itself matters. Was there a threat to life? Did someone experience death? Or the event was unpredictable or completely out of their control? These characteristics can turn an ordinary event into stressful, that is more overwhelming for the person. And finally, there is the power of social support. Having people to lean on, to talk to, and to help you through tough times can make all the difference. It can be the buffer that softens the blow, or the safety net that catches you when you fall. So, when we look at the trauma, it's not just about the event itself, it's about who we are, what the event was like, and the support we have around us. These three pieces together tell us trauma touches each of us so differently. Why? Now, let me explain how the brain reacts when trauma strikes. Imagine your brain as a smoke detector that suddenly goes off at the slightest hint of danger. Your survival circuits ignite, flooding your brain with stress hormones and gearing you up to face the threat. Our brains are composed of three parts: cerebrum, cerebellum, and brainstem. But when it comes to trauma, three key main players take center stage: amygdala, hippocampus, and the prefrontal cortex. Think of the amygdala as your brain's alarm system. It's the part that senses danger, sparks fear, and kicks off your body's stress response, classic fight and flight. After trauma, this alarm system malfunctions and it starts sounding false alarms, mistaking safer situations for danger. Our body gets stuck on high alert, working overtime. That's why you might feel jumpy or react strongly to things that are not really threat. Next, the hippocampus. This part of the brain files away memories, putting our experiences in order and telling us what's past and what's present. But trauma can shrink this vital part, scrambling memories into fragments and sensory flashes. That's why those who have faced trauma might struggle with learning, have fuzzy recollections, and flashbacks. Suddenly, what should feel safe can trigger the body to react as if the trauma is happening all over again right now because brain can't place them in time and place. Now the prefrontal cortex, which is like the brain CEO, the one in charge of thinking, planning, decision making, managing emotions. But trauma can dim its activity, a state called hypofrontality. When this happens, it's harder to control emotions, think clearly under pressure, focus, remember things, distractions multiply, and decision making becomes a really challenging task. All these three brain areas are linked to what we call as hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or the HPA axis for short. Think of it as the brain's command center for stress. It controls the release of cortisol, the stress hormone, gearing you up to face the threat and calming you down when the threat has passed. But trauma throws this system off balance and the cortisol floods the brain and disrupt the way these three key areas work as I have mentioned earlier. Think of a brain as a beautifully designed machine. Trauma forces it into emergency mode, rerouting circuits, shutting down certain functions, and overstimulating others. Mental health disorders often arise from malfunction, but from the brain's desperate attempt to keep a person alive. When trauma is severe and chronic, people can develop mental health disorders. The ongoing stress and dysregulation in the brain can lead to plethora of conditions such as depression, anxiety, substance use disorder, most common being post-traumatic stress disorder or even suicidality. This is why early support and intervention are so important. Before moving on intervention, I like to touch on post-traumatic stress disorder. The first foremost condition being experiencing or witnessing a event that a person perceives as life-threatening. Other criteria being reliving the trauma over and over again through nightmares, flashbacks, and intense emotions that feel overwhelming. People often goes to great lengths also to avoid anything that reminds them of those memories. They develop pessimistic beliefs about themselves, the world around them, and the future. Exaggerated startle response, poor sleep, and concentration are the things that are also present. Often we speak of depression, anxiety, or sleepless nights as isolated struggles. without realizing that many of these problems can due to unaddressed trauma. Because of the stigma around mental health, lack of family support, or simply unawareness too, countless people live with that pain that remains unnamed. This silence keeps them from seeking help, and it is precisely why trauma intervention is vital. Every human being carries stories of pain and resilience. Trauma intervention begins when we create a safe space for those stories to be heard, understood, and transformed. There are many evidence based therapies available, such as trauma focused cognitive behavioral therapy, hypnotherapy, uh, eye movement desensitization therapy, and many more. While there are countless techniques within these approaches, let me highlight a couple of them to illustrate the process. One such method is called Tree of Life. This narrative and strength based approach, which uses a metaphor of a tree to represent different parts of a person's life, past, present, and future. By labeling these parts yourself, you begin to rediscover the forgotten strengths and reflect on the person you want to become. The aim of this technique is to encourage people to recognize their capabilities rather than concentrating on their vulnerabilities. Another method is called grounding technique. It's all about bringing your focus back here and now, helping you manage distress when overwhelming thoughts, anxiety, or flashbacks take over. Grounding interrupts those intense feelings and guides you back to the place of safety. Some ways are breathing, muscle relaxation exercises, spending time in nature, meditation, or simply listening to music. Finally, I want to talk about emotion regulation skills, which is part of DBT. The goal is to name and understand our own emotions, decrease the frequency of unpleasant emotions and our vulnerability to them. Few techniques in this are STOP, which is an acronym for stop, take a step back, observe, proceed mindfully, positive self talk skill, cope ahead skill, and many more. Now, it's important to understand that trauma can lead to feelings of helplessness, hopelessness, and despair, leading people towards suicide. Suicidality is a serious risk for those struggling with trauma, especially when they feel isolated or overwhelmed. That is why seeking help is not just important, it can be life saving. Psychologists and mental health professionals are here to support those affected by trauma. They provide a safe space to explore these difficult feelings, teach coping strategies, and help rebuild a sense of safety. Through therapy, people can learn to manage their symptoms, process their experiences, and find hope again. If you or someone you knew are struggling, reaching out for help is a brave and vital step. Remember, you are not alone, and support is available to guide you through this healing journey. Thank you.